Hello, and welcome to this episode of the Slow Tycoon podcast. In this episode, I am joined by Mr. Andrew Copson. He is the Chief Executive of Humanists UK, a charity dedicated to the secularization of the UK with a focus on human rights, and President of Humanists International, which is a similar organization working at an international scale. He is also a writer and has authored several articles and books on secularism and humanism, including Secularism, Politics, Religion and Freedom, which was published by the Oxford University Press. He is also a fellow of the Royal Society of Arts. So welcome to the podcast, Mr. Copson. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
So this will be an interesting conversation. Our discussion today primarily will revolve around secularism, and I think it would be safe to assume that most of the people listening to this probably will have come across the term secularism but won't be really acquainted with it. So what exactly is secularism? So could you just define it to us?
Absolutely. Of course, there are many different definitions around the world, but the one that most people share, that most politicians use, that most academics use, that most campaigners use, is that secularism is a certain way of organizing politics, our communities, our states. And this way of organizing politics is one that makes religious and state institutions separate, so that there's no domination of one set of those institutions from the other. That's the first thing a secular state does. That's the first thing secularism is. The second thing that secularism is that it's an approach by the state that tries to maximize the freedom of thought, conscience, and religion of everyone within the state. So the second thing secularism is about is the human right to freedom of belief for as many people as possible and as much as possible, compatible with the rights of other people, of course, within the state. And the third thing that secularism is it's the equal treatment, the treatment without discrimination of every person, regardless of their religion or belief. So in a secular state, these institutions are separate religious and political institutions. There's a quest for the maximum freedom of thought that's possible. And also people are treated equally on grounds of their religion or belief, and no one is favored or privileged or discriminated against on those grounds.
Do you think it is fair to say that secularism is the application of sort of liberal principles on how churches and state organizations should interact with each other? Do you think that would be fair to say?
I think a lot of people do say that, you're right. And they say that, liberalism is a bigger political philosophy, a bigger political approach. And secularism is liberalism applied to questions of religion and belief, political questions of religion and belief. And I think there's a lot in that. That's right. Secularism is, in many ways, a liberal approach to these questions. But I think it would be a mistake to categorize secularism as only liberal, because you can buy into secularism as a way of organizing the state without being a liberal. You can be a very conservative person, even a very religious person of all sorts of different religions, and still believe in secularism because you think secularism offers the best way for people, including you, with lots of different beliefs, to live together in peace, to have the maximum fairness that you can have in society, and to have the maximum personal freedom that you can have in society. An individual Muslim or Christian or Jew is more free in a secular state to practice their religion, to pursue it, and to live their values than they are in a theocratic state of a different religion.
Yeah.
Or sometimes if they're a minority, even in their own religion, they might be more free in a secular state than they are in a state that is of their religion, but not quite the same religion.
Like the different denominations.
Exactly. A different denomination or sect or whatever. And so, although lots of the origin points of secularism in history have been with great liberals and liberal thought and liberal humanist thought particularly, there have also been great religious contributors to the formulation of secularism, and religious people today and conservatives today as well as liberals can all support secularism as the best way to keep us all free.
So just on that topic of religious people, don't you think that religious people have their own biases towards their own books or something like that? Or can they really be secular in the sense that they will keep their political affiliations and religious affiliations separate? Because when you tend to believe in a particular book as the absolute truth or the absolute word of God, you are probably going to make sure that your political affiliations also align with that ideology. Don't you think that also is a factor here?
Well, of course. Yeah, no, I understand your point. And it's obviously the case that there are a great number of religious people who don't support secularism. and not just hardline theocrats who think that their way is the best way. There are people who don't support secularism because they support maybe softer established church systems or multiculturalist systems of politics and organisation of the state. So, of course, not all religious people are secularists. I agree. Not all non-religious people are secularists either, in fact. But I think that, so that's true. But I don't think necessarily that point you make about if you believe that your religion is the true one, then you must want to organise the state according to it. I don't think that's necessarily true, because there are plenty of religious people, not the hardline theocrats, but plenty of religious people who completely believe in their religion, believe that it is the only truth and the only way, but still they accept and support secularism because either they take a practical view of reality and say, well, okay, I do think this about my religion, but in fact, I'm in a minority. Or, I accept that other people don't believe the same thing. Or, not only that, those sort of personal reasons they might have for practical reasons for supporting secularism, many people think they have religious reasons for supporting secularism. So, for example, I've heard Muslim supporters of secularism refer to the idea in Islam that there should be no compulsion in religion, and that therefore a secular state is actually in keeping with their Islamic values. I've heard Christians support secularism because they say that there should be no barrier, no intermediary between the individual and between God, and therefore it's not the role of the state to try and impose Christianity, because the relationship a Christian has with God is personal. And of course, I've heard Jews support secularism out of their own religion, using the reasoning that because they live not in a Jewish state but in a shared state, there's a religious obligation on them as individual Jews to support the common order, the politics of the jurisdiction that they're in. And so, there are religious ideas, even religious texts that are supportive of secularism. So even a hardline religious person, even a scriptural literalist, I think, can believe in secularism, not just for practical reasons, but for religious reasons too.
If you ever meet a religious person who is probably not a secularist, how would you go about convincing them to be a secularist? Would you just say that it is in their best interest? How will you go about conveying the message to them?
Well, I would try to persuade them probably in three ways. First of all, I would say that it is in their best interests to support a secular state, that we will all have greater individual freedom if we accept and support the freedom of others, of our fellow citizens within the community, and of everyone within the boundaries of our political unit, state, or wherever we might be. We'll all have greater freedom if we support each other's freedom. And I would try to say to them, don't you agree that we should give to other people what we want for ourselves, and therefore if we want to be free to pursue our values, other people should be able to do the same, as long as it doesn't interfere with the rights and freedoms of others. So I try and make arguments to them on the grounds of their own aspirations for their own freedom and their children's freedom and their co-believers' freedom, and the debt that they owe to others if they want that freedom respected. Then I would try, I think, to make arguments around fairness. I would say, is it fair that your son or your daughter, if they changed their religious view, might find themselves unable to access education or get the job they wanted or have the life they wanted, to vote maybe, or to do any of the things that people who are of the wrong beliefs are forbidden from doing in non-secular states. So I try to make arguments about fairness. And I think that, again, those arguments of fairness are ones that can transcend religious boundaries. I think people have a sense of fairness that crosses over those divides. And then I think if all else failed, I would make an argument about peace. I would say, look at the history of this world. Look at the blood-drenched soil of Europe and Asia, when religions have allowed to become political, to divide us in that way, and where the state has taken a side in these big religious questions. Is that what we want? Wouldn't we rather live in a greater sort of peace together and avoid that sort of war of all against all. Now, those arguments won't convince everyone, because there are some people who will say, no, I don't believe in freedom for people who are wrong. No, I don't believe in fairness. I think I'm right and so I should be privileged. No, I don't believe in peace. I believe that my way will conquer through war. But hopefully by persuasion, we will keep those numbers to a manageable minority of people who say those things.
When you try to talk about the best possible secular state, what do you actually envision? Or is there any particular state or any particular type of secularism which has probably come closest to that vision of yours? Like, you talk about a variety of secular states in your book, I think. The Turkish Republic under Ataturk, or you also talk about the US Constitution. So do you think any of them has come the closest?
I think the important thing to say is that there has never been a completely secular state. So if we think back to those three aspects, separation, the freedom of belief, and the non-discrimination, there isn't any state in the world today, and never has been, where these things have been perfectly implemented. So I think we need to look for states that have come perhaps closest to this. And you're right, in my book on secularism, I do use as examples of secular states France, the US, and India. I do refer to Turkey, and I do write a chapter about Turkey, but in fact, I think my conclusion is that Turkey is not a secular state and never has been really a very secular state, in spite of its claims. And I think that at different times and in different ways, the republics of France, America, and India have offered good example of secularism. Not necessarily today very much, in the case of India, certainly. And of course, France and America have their problems, and none of them are perfect. But I think it's in those three states that we should turn if we wanted to find good examples of secularism. Now, of course, there are big debates in these states. In America, they have many problems, especially with evangelical Christianity interpenetrating with politics. In the US, and that's always been a problem for American secularism, the political Christians and the white nationalists and Christian nationalists that they have today. In France, of course, the debates between secularists and Catholics may be only recently long over, really. But of course, the position of Muslims in France has become a great debate. Does secularism bite down too hard on the religious practices in particular of Muslims and Sikhs when it comes to religious dress, and Jews too? There have been debates about that, but I think that they've largely been on the margins and of the debate about secularism. I mean, there might also be problems with racism and prejudice in France, but I don't think secularism is so much in the firing line for that. And in India, of course, today,
the
right-wing
you have
an
BJP.
anti-secularist party in charge. There's a Hindu nationalist party in charge of India, so you've got these problems in India, and so I wouldn't look around the world and say, yes, there are really perfect secular states now, but I think those three examples have offered good causes, good case studies in the past. There are also states today that do quite well in the same way. Sweden would be a good example. It's becoming ever more secular. Norway is moving away from its established church position. Staying in Western Europe for the moment, the Scotland, which is not a state but is a jurisdiction of its own, is becoming more and more secular and offering good lessons in how to do that. But there's never been perfection in this respect. And more than that, I don't think there ever will be. The best we can hope to do is to come closer to that ideal.
I think you previously said about the fact that religious people tend to think that, the theocratic type of religious people tend to think that they're absolutely right in that respect. So, what is the most challenging argument against secularism you probably have come across as of yet?
Well, I think, as a liberal person, instinctively, I think I probably find the liberal arguments against secularism the most convincing. I don't find the theocratic arguments against secularism convincing, of course, because you have to believe in the relevant gods in each case to find those arguments plausible, and I don't. And I don't believe in the sort of multiculturalist arguments against secularism, because I think they break down, anything built on the notion of group rights breaks down when you think about people who don't want to be part of a group or who want to leave a group, or, so I think the whole multiculturalist argument against secularism breaks down pretty quickly. I suppose the two arguments I find most persuasive, or I'm not persuaded by them, but the strongest arguments, to use your word, is the established church argument against secularism. Actually, firstly, before we come to the liberal argument, there's a sort of established church argument against secularism, which says, look at the states that have historic established churches, so they're not secular, but they're Christian states, like, for example, England or Sweden until recently, Denmark, and so on. And, people who make an argument against secularism point out that in those states, even though there isn't separation of church and state, there are high levels of freedom of thought and conscience and belief, and high levels also of equal treatment and non-discrimination. And so people who argue against secularism and instead advance the cause for established churches will say it seems to them that established churches can provide the benefits that secularism claims to provide just as well, if not better, than secular states. Now, I don't think that's plausible, actually, because in all those states that I've just listed that have established churches, there's quite a lot of discrimination against people who don't belong to those churches, and specifically quite a lot of discrimination against the non-religious, so people who believe, don't belong to any religious denomination. But nonetheless, it's a persuasive historical argument. I think the strongest argument, though, that gets me doubtful is the liberal argument against secularism. And the liberal argument against secularism is strong because, of course, it comes out of the mouths, really, of secularism's own children, the people who benefited from the secular approach all their lives, because they come from, maybe they're American academics or French academics or British academics. Of course, Britain, though a very Christian state, is in many ways also a very secular state. In practice, they're not in law. And these are the people who say, well, that what's wrong with secularism is that secularism pretends to be neutral, pretends to be objective, but it's not. Because in fact, secularism privileges a very Western, a very Christian understanding of what religion is, of what politics is, and so on and so forth. It does this at the top level by saying, for example, that religion and politics even can be separated. These people say that's a humanist assumption or a Christian assumption or a Western assumption. In that way, it does it at a low level, in a issues by issues level. These critics will say when it, for example, privileges historically Christian ideas about marriage. For example, Mormons in the US, Mormons in America in the 19th century weren't allowed to have more than one wife. Mormon men weren't allowed to have more than one wife. Whereas on the face of it, secularism might have indicated that they should have been allowed to have more than one wife. So the liberal argument against secularism is that it privileges and encodes and is biased towards particular Christian and Western understandings of matters. And I think that's probably the strongest argument against secularism. Yes, so that's the so it's the liberal arguments against secularism that I find most persuasive, the ones that say it isn't truly neutral or objective. But really, the answer to those arguments is to say, well, it's true that secularism isn't completely objective or completely neutral, but then it doesn't claim to be, actually. That's a false characterization of what secularism is, because secularism is full of values. It's not neutral on many values questions. First of all, secularists believe that freedom is good. They believe that fairness is good. Yeah. They believe that peace is better than conflict. And so, that's a lot of values right there. And I think that, the liberal argument against secularism is defeated by secularists simply saying, well, we're not saying secularism is perfect, but it's better than all the alternatives.
So that's the best possible method or the best possible way to achieve?
I think so, yeah, that we know of so far.
So I think it would be a good way to wrap up this conversation. So, how do you think we could achieve the ideal secular state? Say, for example, in the UK, what I have been noticing or what I have been reading about is that there probably is this state is switching towards this sort of multicultural approach to religion, because by opening faith schools of a variety of religion, Muslims or Jewish faith schools, I think the Church of England like shrouded itself from criticisms by saying that let's offer faith schools to almost every denomination.
Yes, that's basically right. Yeah.
So, like, how do you think you could achieve the best possible secular state in terms of the UK or in terms of internationally?
Well, that's a very acute and intelligent analysis you've just made of the situation in England, because you're right. The situation in England very much is that we're moving from an established church state, well, historically from a theocratic, Anglican state, to an established church state, and now to a sort of multiculturalist state with church approval, because, as you say, it's the best way for the Church of England to, like you say, shroud itself from criticism, which is an excellent phrase, and that's true. But so I think that the competing trend, though, within England and within the UK is the secularizing one, and in the UK. In England specifically, that is greatly assisted by the decline of religion. So you don't have to have the decline of religion to have a secular state. There were plenty of very religious people in the United States when the Constitution was adopted there in the late 18th century, and there are plenty of very religious people in France when secularism was adopted there, and still are plenty of religious people in France. But in the UK, at least at the moment, the secularizing tendency is assisted by the decline of personal religion in the UK. And so although you do have this multicultural approach creeping in, especially in things like public services, you also have small changes in the opposite direction. So changes in the school curriculum, for example, growing opposition to discrimination, religious discrimination, admission to those state schools you talk about. So I think the way that a secular state will come in England, if it ever does, or a more secular state, maybe we should say, is not by some great one-off revolution, but by a series of small changes that slowly moderates and reforms the present system to be more equal, to be more fair, to be more about the individual freedom of people. And we're assisted by that in the UK because we have now domestic human rights legislation, which means that policy can be challenged by citizens through the courts, which we didn't used to have, but we now have had recently in my lifetime. And also equality legislation where religion or belief is included as a characteristic within our equality law that you can challenge practice on the grounds of. So against that multiculturalist trend in England is a growing trend also of individual freedom and fairness, which is protected through law. And so I think that small changes that come out of that trend will be the way in which secularism is advanced.
Finally, thank you so much, Mr. Copson, for joining me on the podcast for such a pleasant and enlightening conversation. And I should also add that it indeed was a very important one, considering that we now need secularism more than ever in this ever so diversifying world.
Thank you very much. It was a wonderful conversation, and thank you.
And to the ones listening to this, in case you're looking for more resources on secularism and its progress at an international scale, you can check out the link of Humanists International in the description of this video. And as always, leave a like if you enjoyed this episode, and thank you so much for tuning in.